Hi, I'm Courtney Darling, and I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Extension Agent in Suwannee County. Today we'll be giving you a virtual tour of 4 different Bahiagrass cultivars that we have planted at the North Florida Research and Education Center in Suwannee Valley. And today we're at the SAP BMP demonstration site.
Bahiagrass is the most commonly planted warm season perennial forage in Florida, especially for grazing livestock. It is adapted to low soil fertility and low input management. And despite these low input requirements, it still produces adequate yield in animal performance, making it a popular choice for livestock producers. The 4 cultivars we will be discussing today are Pensacola, Argentine, Tifton 9, and Riata. Pensacola Bahiagrass is believed to have arrived to the Pensacola area of Florida. It is a diploid type grass with narrow leaves. It is a good seed producer and is persistent under intensive grazing. Production occurs from early spring to midsummer, slowing down towards the end of summer and fall. This allows for the interseeding of cool season forages with minimal impact to the production of the Bahiagrass. This is a popular cultivar with an estimated 60% of Bahiagrass acreage being planted in Pensacola. There is currently a problem, however, with obtaining clean Pensacola seed. A weed called Brunswick grass, which is also in the paspalum family, has infested Bahiagrass fields, especially throughout the north and central parts of Florida. Brunswick seeds are too similar in appearance and weight to Bahiagrass seed to be sorted out mechanically, therefore causing contaminated seed supplies. A major difference between the 2 seeds is color. Therefore, if you notice a brown seed color in your Bahiagrass seed, this is most likely contaminated with Brunswick grass. Brunswick grass seeds are brown, whereas the Bahiagrass seeds are white. Argentine Bahiagrass is an ecotype introduced from Argentina. It is highly productive with excellent spreading, but has lower seed production compared to Pensacola. However, the seeds are larger, and this cultivar is noted to have wider leaves. As you can see in this picture, the plant above is of Argentine Bahiagrass, and you can see how much thicker the leaf blades are compared to the lower plant, which is Pensacola Bahiagrass. Although Argentine is less cold tolerant than Pensacola, this allows for earlier overseeding of cool season forages because it does go dormant sooner in the season. Argentine has less of an issue with Brunswick grass contamination because the seeds are larger. This cultivar also prefers wetter soils, but much like Pensacola, it can tolerate overgrazing. This field of Argentine that we are in has been recently grazed and is not an indication of forage yield differences between the 2 cultivars. Both Pensacola and Argentine seed are easy to find and are sold at most feed and seed stores. Tifton 9 was developed and released by the University of Georgia in the United States Department of Agriculture. It is a selection from Pensacola that has been noted to have superior yields in early to late fall. And while it is an excellent choice to extend the grazing season, it should not be overgrazed. Unlike Argentine and Pensacola, it does not tolerate intensive overgrazing and is best suited under rotational grazing management. You also don't want to overseed forages cool season forages that will last into the spring. Instead, you want to look for early maturing forages that will not impact Tifton 9 green up in the spring. Tifton 9 has greater seedling vigor. It grows more upright than Pensacola and does not form as dense of a sod, but can yield about 10 to 30% more dry matter. Some Tifton 9 has had issues with Brunswick grass contamination as well. But seed can be found through the Georgia Crop Improvement Association. Riata is another selection from Pensacola. that was released by the University of Florida in 2007. It was selected for its low day length sensitivity, providing further production in early spring and late fall. And although it can lack consistency during peak growing in the summer compared to other cultivars, it offers the longest growing season and is a possible alternative to extend the grazing season. However, much like Tifton 9, you would have to utilize cool season forages that mature earlier and do not impact spring greenup of Riata. Riata hasn't had the issues with Brunswick grass contamination as Pensacola and Tifton 9 have. It also tends to yield 10% higher than Tifton 9. It is well adapted all the way from South Florida to North Carolina, with good disease resistance. One caveat to this cultivar is that it does not tolerate overgrazing, much like Tifton 9, and is best utilized in a rotational grazing system. This field was also recently grazed, and again is not an indication of forage yield compared to the other cultivars. Clean Riata seed can be purchased through Reagan and Massey out of Louisiana.
Hello, my name is Keith Wynn, and I am a University of Florida Extension Agent in Hamilton County. Today we're going to discuss the steps of conducting a soil sample in a Bahia grass pasture. I feel this is one of the more important management practices that one could do as far as producing good quality Bahia grass forage. You can go by your local extension office and request to either borrow one of the soil probes that's available throughout most of the offices, or you can ask them where you can find one of these if you'd like to purchase one. They normally run around $100, $150 depending on which one you purchase. Your extension office or your extension agent will provide to you a nutrient testing form for Bahia grass sheet that you can fill out. It could be a little confusing, so discuss this sheet with your extension agent because there's some different options that you can pick on this. For example, as far as your nitrogen option, there's a low option, a medium option, a high option, and a hay option. And whatever your management practices are for that field, if it's a pasture, depending on the amount of cattle that you have in that field, that will help you determine which one of these options that you would like to pick. The sample it's a $10 sample, but your extension agent could help you with filling this form out. One thing to remember is that on your soil bags, you need to make sure that your sample ID number matches your sample ID that you have included on this. And one mistake I've seen in the past is on the sample ID, make sure you make a note somewhere what that ID name is, and so that you can go back when you get your results to determine where that actual sample come from, which field it come from. We've got some producers that'll take 2 of these samples or conduct 2 soil samples. We've got some producers that can do up to 60 at one time. So if you're doing multiple samples from multiple fields, it's very important that you ID that sample with some way of remembering it whenever you get your results back. So you've got your bags that you've picked up at your extension office. You've borrowed a probe, so you're ready to go to the field. Once you go to the field, you'll need to get a clean bucket. Try to pick a bucket that does not have any organic matter already in it that could influence your test one way or the other. So you'd want to get a clean bucket. Whenever you go out into a field, it's recommended that you do 1 soil sample, and I'm going to call this a soil sample per 40-acre field. So you'll go out into the field and you'll want to do random samples throughout that 40-acre field. So what you would do is you would go through and you would pull 1 core a core would be 6 inches deep in multiple random areas throughout that field. And then you would dump that core into your bucket. And you would probably want to take at least 12, if not 15 or more cores, and you would mix those up in your bucket, and that will make one sample. A lot of the time we get questions on, so is it one sample for 40 acres or one sample for 5 acres or for 10 acres? One recommendation that I've made in the past is that if you have a visible difference in that pasture, whether one area in the field is growing adequately and one area might look like it has some kind of deficiency, maybe split that field into 2 sample areas and pull a good sample and a bad sample from that field, and then you can determine if there is a difference. But I think that by taking multiple random cores using this tool is by far the best way to get a sample that's representative of that entire field. Today, I will be collecting a soil sample in a 4-acre Bahiagrass field. Here, I'm using a soil probe to collect one core that is 6 inches deep. Your field size will help determine the distance between each core sampling site. This was a small pasture, so in order to collect the 15 cores needed to complete the sample, the distance between each collection site was limited. Always remember to thoroughly mix your sample before bagging it, because the 15 cores will provide more soil than is needed to fill the bag. However, regardless the size of your field, you should always avoid collecting the entire sample from one collection site. Now that you have conducted a soil test in your Bahiagrass pasture and have submitted it to the University of Florida Soils Lab, you can expect to receive your results in 1 to 2 weeks. Today, I will try to explain what you can expect once you receive your results. I plan to focus on pH, the macronutrients nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and discuss the recommended split application schedule of each. I have reports of each of the Bahiagrass nitrogen options that have been submitted this year in Hamilton County. Just a reminder that your results will be based on the options you choose when filling out the submittal form. A couple of things I would like to point out when you're filling out this form is the crop codes. For instance, you have 2 options here. You've got a 35 and a 36. The 35, you would choose that if you was planting a new Bahiagrass pasture. You would choose 36 if you had an established Bahiagrass. And if you choose 36, this is where you can select low, medium, or high as far as your nitrogen options. This is an example of what you could expect once you receive your report back. If you notice in the top that it has the soil test results and their interpretations, And here it's got lime and fertilizer recommendations. We're going to discuss in detail these two different parts of the report. This portion of the soil report is often considered by most producers as the most important. It discusses the soil pH and nutrient results. In this sample, the soil's pH was 5.6. The target pH for Bahia grass is listed as 5.5. Since the soil pH was higher than the target pH, the Adams-Evans buffer pH was not determined because there is no need to apply any lime. The macronutrients phosphorus and potassium in this sample are also high, which should be encouraging to the producer because this soil sample is in the optimum range for Bahia grass growth. We are often asked what the ranges are for phosphorus and potassium to consider them low, medium, or high. In this insert, you can see where these ranges come from. On the bottom portion of the report, the lime and fertilizer recommendations are listed. Note that the lime requirement is 0 and the nitrogen requirement is 50. There is no phosphorus requirement because it was rated high, and for the potassium requirement, you are referred to footnote 131. I do want to point out here that nitrogen is not tested in the soil sample, and the nitrogen recommendation is based on research. And on the Bahia grass sample, it is determined by the nitrogen option that you chose. This producer chose the low nitrogen option. If you are wondering where the footnote 131 comes from, it comes from the IFAS Standardized Fertilization Recommendations for Agronomic Crops EDIS publication. The footnote 131 will be included in your soil report. This producer chose the low nitrogen option and would follow these recommendations. Apply 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the early spring. Do not apply any potassium and only apply phosphorus if the report showed low phosphorus levels and you conducted a tissue sample that was below 0.15%. This is the nitrogen option often used by producers grazing 3 acres per cattle and is the least expensive. In this report, you can tell the producer chose the medium nitrogen option due to the recommended nitrogen rate. If you notice, his pH is 6.1, where the target pH once again is 5.5 for Bahia grass. If you notice on his phosphorus, it is still high, however his potassium is low. Notice down here there is not a lime requirement, and even though his potassium is low, he is still referred to footnote 131 for the potassium recommendation. When looking over the footnote for the medium nitrogen option, you will notice a few things. One, you will notice to apply the 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the early spring. This producer will not have to apply any phosphorus because his test was high. However, his potassium was low, so to get optimum performance out of his Bahia grass, he would also have to apply 50 pounds of potassium. In this report, you can tell that this producer chose the high nitrogen option simply because it recommends 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Let's look at the top and look at his pH. So his pH was 5.9, a little above the target pH of 5.5. So once again, there is not a lime requirement. Whenever you're looking at his soil nutrients, the phosphorus level was high and the potassium level was high. When this producer looks in his footnotes at the high nitrogen option, he will notice that he should apply 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Here, however, he would apply that in two split applications, 80 pounds of nitrogen in the early spring and 80 pounds of nitrogen in the early summer. This producer will not have to apply phosphorus because his phosphorus rates were high, and he will not have to apply potassium because his potassium rates were high. If you notice in the high nitrogen option, however, that there is sufficient nutrient for a single cutting of hay if desired. If you wish to make a single cutting of hay from your Bahiagrass pasture at the end of the season, you should follow the recommendations under the Bahiagrass cut sometimes for hay footnote. If you followed the low nitrogen option, you would have to supply 80 pounds of additional nitrogen and 50 pounds of potassium if your soil test was low in potassium 6 weeks before the growing season ends. If you followed the medium nitrogen option, you would have to supply an additional 80 pounds of nitrogen 6 weeks before the growing season ends. If you followed the high nitrogen option, depending on your management strategies, you would not have to apply any additional nutrients to make a single cutting of hay. If you choose to only cut hay from your Bahiagrass, then you would need to apply 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the early spring, also 80 pounds of potassium if your soil tests were low in potassium, 40 pounds of potassium if your soil test was medium in potassium. You would also need to apply 40 pounds of phosphorus if your soil test was low in phosphorus and the tissue phosphorus concentration was below 0.15%. After each cutting of hay, you would then need to reapply 80 pounds of nitrogen and 40 pounds of potassium per acre. Thank you for your interest in Bahiagrass production. Hopefully, we have answered some of your management questions regarding varieties, soil sampling, and fertility requirements.